The recent events in Moscow show that the screws are tightening and the North Korea is not far away. We must understand that everyone involved in this information struggle or information confrontation is already playing to the enemy's advantage by simply using the word Russia. Russia is a myth, a massive, powerful myth. Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Centre and NGO Eurasia. And I'm your host, Matt Wickham. And in this episode, we discuss the dynamics surrounding Russia's identity, geopolitical future, and its internal stability. If you want to learn more about this subject, please continue watching this video and don't forget to press subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any of our videos in the future. In this episode, the experts introduce the notion of replacing the term Russia with the more neutral term Northern Eurasia, highlighting the symbolic power and myths attached to the concept of Russia, exploring the historical roots and evolution of Russia's identity. They emphasize the consolidation of a new concept of a future Russian empire in response to past losses and imperial ambitions, and examine the influences of political Eurasianism and the Russian world ideology on contemporary Russian politics. Volodymyr Gorbach, Executive Director of the Project, Executive Director of the Institute for the Transformation of Northern Eurasia, discusses the power of naming Russia something else and why. Let's take a listen. It is obvious that the allusion is to North Korea, and it is correct. The recent events in Moscow show that the screws are tightening and the North Korea is not far away. Of course, this is an euphemism for what we call Russia. We must understand that everyone involved in this information struggle or information confrontation is already playing to the enemy's advantage by simply using the word Russia. Russia is a myth, a massive, powerful myth. If a state exists, it is called the Russian Federation rather than Russia. Russia is an image, a country or something similar, and it serves as a powerful symbol in their foreign policy. Northern Eurasia is a geographic term. It's neutral, scientific, and descriptive. It encompasses not only the Russian state, known as the Russian Federation, but also everything that is associated with it: society, economy, culture, and so on. As a result, this is an attempt to, on our part, replace it, albeit not entirely, of course. We won't get anywhere with the term Russia, and we will continue to use it whether we like it or not. A year ago, when we founded our organisation, we felt that duplicating it with a descriptive term as Northern Eurasia with an allusion to North Korea was both appropriate and relevant. I hope that the name is appropriate and will be used by journalists, politicians, and eventually other people, including our partners. Our institute will address this issue, not only Russia, but it goes a little beyond the current Russian Federation. But what is our purpose? How do we see our mission? Or what do we envision as the actual key problem? And what should we do about it? The fact is that the cynical nature of Russian history repeats itself, and we will be doomed to repeat it alongside it, go through these circles of hell, unless we break the circle at some point. It must first be broken in the semantic field, in our minds. What's the problem? To control Northern Eurasia, or to be controlled by Moscow, a centralized state is required. To maintain control, a centralized state produces totalitarian propaganda. Totalitarian propaganda leads to external aggression, internal repression, and an overall collapse. Then, everything happens again. How can we avoid this process or scenario? Firstly, we must break the cycle of centralized government. It would be necessary and productive to transform this territory, Northern Eurasia, so that it is internally structured and organized differently, rather than as a centralized state. There may be different options and opinions, and they may be discussed, but the outcome will be what it will be, not what someone planned. It is critical that these political entities in Northern Eurasia balance each other out, compete economically, and limit each other militarily. In general, they should participate in European and possible Asian integration processes. This is in fact our initial vision for the processes that should occur and how this space should be transformed in a manner that would be safe for both us and the rest of the world. Iryna Pavlenko, PhD in Historical Sciences, head of the Department of Political System Development, National Institute for Strategic Studies, and our next guest delves into Russia's post-Soviet identity crisis and its quest for a new national narrative. She explores the emergence of political Eurasianism and the Russian world ideology, examining their influence on contemporary Russian politics. Let's listen to more.
In this section, I try to demonstrate the history of the formation of this new concept of Russia and the vision of the future of Russia. A history conditioned by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fear of further collapse of the Russian Federation. A history conditioned by the fact that in the 1990s, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russians were faced with the question of what is Russia, which lost significant parts of its territory during the 20th century, in the early 20th century, and in the late 20th century. That is, what is Russia without all this? And the question arose as to what Russians are. Again, I tried to make a cursory historical excursion into the history of Russian imperialism. Cursory because this is not a historical monograph devoted exclusively to this issue. And to demonstrate this evolution of mental development, to demonstrate, to explain, to give an explanation of why the concept of a liberal Russia, a different Russia, one that had not existed yet, was in fact still born in the 1990s, why it had no prospects. I derived the factors of this futility not from economic reasons, not from the economic problems of this transitional stage of the 1990s. How all this imperialism, all this longing for what was lost, the sense of defeat in the Cold War, the fear of disintegration and further destabilization, the fear of losing this concept of Russia, the Russian people and Russian culture invented long before the 20th century. All this motivated and consolidated the population and elite of this territory to develop a new concept of a new Russia, a new future empire. These are the two main emphases. I analyzed two such mainstream discourses that began in the 1990s. These are political Eurasianism and the civilizational Russian world, and how they later formed the basis of what we today call Russianism. Here it is necessary to add a nuance, that it was not Dugin who influenced Putin. But Dugin is quoted a lot, precisely because he is such a publicist, very verbose. He is very good at showing us the dominant opinions in Russian society, in the Russian elites. The analysis of both the Eurasian concept and the concept of the Russian world makes it possible to predict the future a little bit. Because if everything that was written and said, and is written and said, coincides with what the Russian Federation is doing as a state, then we can assume what awaits us in the future and what they are striving for. With this entire chapter, I try to prove that they want to realize the concept of building a great Eurasian Russian empire. The logic is incredibly simple. They are the largest. We cut off China here. They are already cutting it off themselves on this continent. And accordingly, their influence should be decisive on this continent, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, from ocean to ocean. Initially, they applied. I always take a step from ideology to real politics, to real statements of politicians, primarily Putin. To the international integration project they tried to develop, and show that, in principle, they tried to develop this concept initially, so to speak, by hybrid methods. By offering security services to Central Asia, first of all, economic cooperation to Europe, and perceiving the United States, NATO, and the EU as competitive structures for their influence in this space. But it was a utopian approach, because Russia is not economically a country that can compete with the US and the EU as an association in terms of influence in this space. For this reason, and because Putin is old, in the end they could not stand it. They did not have enough patience, they did not have enough opportunities, and they moved to primitive direct military aggression.
The last expert of this episode, Andrii Starodub, PhD in history, tells us about the difficulties of trying to predict Russia's future and whether it will disintegrate, plus how it embodies a Russian matryoshka, a Russian doll that has many smaller ones of shapes and sizes inside. Now, based on some hazy prospects and fragmentary data obtained from open sources, we can conclude that this disintegration is not a long-term prospect. These processes will begin in some form as a result of Russia's ongoing war. So why is it difficult to predict whether Russia will break up into multiple states or remain a loose federation or confederation? I'll say it right away. It's as difficult to predict now as it was in 1913, when Europe's new borders were established. It is as difficult to predict in detail today as it was in the early 1980s or even 1985. Anyone who claimed that we were on the verge of an apocalyptic change and that everything, including borderlines, would shift so dramatically that new expected states would emerge would be labelled visionaries and dreamers. That's why I make this allowance, and in my section I avoid drawing harsh conclusions or specifics, as some people do, and there are already various maps of how Russia will disintegrate. The only limit here is the author's imagination. Russia is a country with many distinct components. It's similar to Matryoshka. However, it is not a Russian invention. Rather, as is customary in Russia, it is brazen borrowing and appropriation. Nevertheless, Russia is a Matryoshka because we only see one shell. There are others inside that we can't see. We can only see a few cracks in its outer shell, which will reveal that there are many matryoshkas inside, and that more of them than it appears. To put it briefly, first, we can't really believe anything. For me, it was a paradoxical discovery that Russia's data on some kind of global economy is now being questioned. Any data is now perceived as proof that Russia is lying, but if you look at the Western literature, you will notice that many people take data related to national consumption, language skills, and other processes occurring in the Russian Federation quite seriously. All of this has no alternatives, and it is all based on official sources that are viewed uncritically. We can see the manipulations occur even at the census level. Even greater manipulations occur when interpreting the data obtained from these censuses. This is especially true for regions that the Kremlin considers critical and capable of claiming independence. Tatarstan is a vivid example, with Tatars accounting for 52 to 33% of the population. There's nothing to say here. That is, the titular nation constitutes of the majority. However, in the interpretations of these censuses, they try to falsify this group as much as possible, claiming that while there are religious and non-religious Tatars, there is one group that should be identified as a separate people, the Krashen, or Tatars who adopted orthodoxy, and so on. All of this serves the same purpose, and in this case, official propaganda and what was once known as the Russian opposition coexist. For example, Navalny once conducted a poll in Tatarstan, which revealed that 38% of the population practiced Islam. What was it about? They are a minority in this republic, and the 38% minority may or may not want anything other than to leave Russia. However, there is no question about the nation's right to self-determination. So the first step is to question and critically evaluate any available data. Second, we must take a closer look at the regions that remain in the shadows and what is going on there. In fact, the Russian authorities, despite claiming that everything is monolithic and wonderful there, and that people's friendships is flourishing, are actively preparing for and fearing the process of disintegration. It became especially noticeable after 2017 to 2018, when they began to discuss cancelling the study of national languages, among other issues, as well as visible personal decisions in the national republics. You've been watching the special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic course, dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine in Flames. In the description under this video, you can find more information on how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!